nos inspiran y nos motivan a ser la mejor versión de nosotros mismos. Ahora que soy ex estudiante, me doy cuenta que con cada una de las experiencias estamos recibiendo algo más importante, un lugar seguro. Cada taller, club o salida recibimos apoyo, confianza e inspiración. Hoy, 5 años después, comprendo que más allá de las habilidades de canto y baile o debate que aprendí la capacidad de superar obstáculos y de ser resiliente. Otro de los aspectos más importantes que vivimos mis compañeros y yo fue contar con modelos positivos a seguir. Antes que el programa llegara a la escuela, tenía compañeros que andaban en malos pasos. Después empezamos a ir a los clubes y empezamos a verlo como nuestro lugar seguro, como nuestro segundo hogar, porque sentíamos que nos protegían, nos daban consejos y nos enseñaban a visualizar un futuro diferente, con metas profesionales y personales. Hoy puedo asegurar que el programa de escuelas comunitarias fue una de las mejores cosas que me pudo haber pasado en mi vida, no solo por todas las habilidades y personas increíbles que conocí, sino por todo el apoyo que me han dado en mi comunidad. Lo mejor de todo era que me enseñaron que sí es posible lograr un futuro diferente. Esto me ha ayudado a desenvolverme en la universidad y el trabajo y creo que me servirá para toda mi vida. En la actualidad estudio 5º año de licenciatura en Contaduría Pública y trabajo en el área. Ni yo me lo creo. Antes de todo este programa, los sueños de los jóvenes acá era trabajar como meseros y las niñas de mi edad se convertían en mamás jóvenes. Hoy pensamos en ser profesionales. Sin duda agradezco a cada club, cada taller y cada salida extracurricular, pero lo que más agradezco son las pláticas, los consejos y la habilidad de estar ahí y ser ese sentido de comunidad que anhelaba.
Awesome. So a great testimony of the impact that it has on lives. What we want to do right now is welcome Selena De Sola from Glasswing and Doug Reagan from UN Habitat and Harold Sibaha. And the three of them have tremendous experience in this area, but looking at the people who are also as part of the event today, I see Enrique Roig and Paul Teeple and John Seibel and lots of others who have tremendous experience in this area. So we really do want to have a discussion and have an answer to some of the questions. But we're going to start, if you wouldn't mind going to the next slide, asking each of our kind of three invited guests to talk a little bit about their model. So Selena, can you talk a little bit about what we've learned about Glasswing's model and how it's grown over the past few years?
Sure. So like you were explaining, Mike, thank you. First, thank you for the opportunity. I'm excited to be here with everybody, with this community of peers. For us, I think when we started 14 years ago, we realized that because kids had, 4 other kids that were in school had 4 hours of schooling, 4.5 hours of schooling a day, either in the morning or the afternoon, we realized schools were empty. And so we were seeing that they had very little time in school and that schools were being underutilized as community resources, but they had amazing convening power. So what we decided to do early on is leverage existing school infrastructure. You were talking about the hardware and the software. So we decided the hardware to kind of leverage that infrastructure and the convening power of schools, and then also convert those schools into centers of community. So bring together other community actors, and through these partnerships, basically implement programming, right? Like we wanted to make schools into safe spaces where kids can feel secure, where they can get together and learn with their peers, have fun, and develop life skills that are critical, particularly in the communities where we work in Latin America, where they face extreme adversity, right? So these are spaces where they could develop relationships with positive, caring adults outside their families, and also places where they can feel more hopeful and have aspirational thinking. So basically, and you can see on the slide, it has different components. We have the after school programs that they're catered to the interests of kids. For us, it's really important to constantly ask students what they're interested in. And most kids participate in these programs 2 hours a week with volunteers who lead these programs. There are about 20 volunteers per school, and we have 1 school coordinator. We also have these community integration activities that involve what you see on the slide. All of our work at this point is trauma informed. We've been learning a lot. And I think going with what Enrique said in the chat, when kids are exposed to trauma, it's really important to think about the mental health aspects of this. So we now work in 10 different countries, and we've been able to scale directly and also scale by transferring methodology to other partners. We've worked with government. So, I think one of the main things is that partnership, making sure that we're present in communities long-term, that we're committed long-term to these relationships, that we have these cross-sector partnerships, and that we stay committed to learning and very flexible. So for us, it's also been really important to conduct constant evaluations, our own and also external independent evaluations, to make sure that we're achieving the outcomes together with the students. And you can see the other two components, which are academic support and also the service learning, going back to the agency, assets, enabling environment, and the contribution. So I think I'll leave it at that, because I know we're going to have a longer conversation in a couple minutes.
Go to the next slide. All right, and now we're going to pass it to Doug and go over to Kenya to hear a little bit more about the model that UN Habitat has been promoting.
Thanks so much. So yeah, really great to be here. So thanks so much. So one of the models that we have, I think our first center was in 2003 in Nairobi, Kenya, was the OneStop Youth Resource Centers. To kind of boil it down to what makes these ones tick, I think there's three areas, let's say. Number one is that we use, very similar to positive youth development, we use what asset-based community development. We really view young people, and we really view the communities. Just a second, I've got to close the door. Apologies, it's getting noisy. So asset-based, so we view the communities having assets as being assets, versus kind of a needs-based approach, which is kind of this never-ending trying to fill a hole. And this is, I think, really important when we're working with at-risk communities, highly at-risk communities, such as in informal settlements, as well as in conflict situations. I mean, the young people in the informal settlements here are vastly young. 70% of the population is under the age of 30. Many of them, cities are becoming younger and younger, and informal settlements even more so than that. I mean, when you're looking at young people who are making $5 a day or less, or if you're looking in conflict situations where there's always threats of violence, there's often this perception that they're all aspirational young people. There's something that we can build them as leaders of tomorrow. Whereas we don't see that. I mean, we see that young people are leaders of today, and we see it all the time, that these young people are able to do amazing things in sometimes horrific situations. So what we really look for is to build that, and that's what we build these centers around. We're not looking for perfect centers, and I really like the previous idea of, looking at schools and saying, okay, they're only in school so many hours, so we can use the schools outside that time. We also do that. We find there's often lots of spaces, oddly enough, in informal settlements and in other, that we can use and modify and renovate. And I say this to my staff all the time. I said, we do not build, we renovate. We always renovate, because especially when you're looking at issues of in cities and such, where nobody really holds title to any land or deed, that if you're starting to try to build from square up, it just can take a long time and can be extremely expensive and not really valuable. So we look at that, and we look at how we can build these centers, and we build the centers based on the capacities of the young people and the capacities of the communities. The leadership style we look at is what we call youth-led development, again, a very asset-based perspective and approach. And I'd say sometimes we might go to the bit of the extreme, because we find oftentimes that young people aren't seen as assets at all to their community and such. So we really try to push this, and we really try to build on it. Then what comes out of that oftentimes we're less concerned with the services that we pre-plan into the space. So we find that there's many commonalities amongst what we plan, but most times we build around, again, where young people see the needs are. So obviously livelihoods is huge, and informal settlements at most of the time builds around waste stream. I mean, plastics recycling, even the running of local toilets is a very big thing in the informal settlements. So we often build in livelihoods and how we can train and how we can do that. But also the other areas that we look at are technology obviously is very big, and young people want that ability, the aspiration to be able to use technology in a way as a way to move on with their lives. We also, recreation is also big. So most of our centers have football pitches that have been actually reclaimed and recovered. And then the third area oftentimes is health. When we initially started our centers, they were VCTs, the voluntary counseling centers for HIV/AIDS. That has since moved on to more to a whole range of other things. And as of right now, of course, the pandemic is the major issue that we're dealing with. Yeah, and then just there are two more pieces. One is that what you see in the picture here is our center in Kigali, in this place called Kimisagara, which is the poorest area of Kigali. Again, they're doing training. This is tailoring, but they have a whole range of different training centers. I mean, this is really one of our best centers. And one piece I did miss, and I mentioned in the thing, is local government. All our stuff, because UN Habitat is the UN agency of cities, and the UN agency of cities and towns and local government, always our partnership is with local government. And we found that this has been a huge asset in terms of sustainability. Local government doesn't go anywhere. There's always going to be local government. Now it can be good and bad and corrupt and so on, but still it's there. And we build into local government, and they also have really great assets such as land. So they're able to provide that. So we really build into that. And the last thing, just to mention, one of the great successes we've had over the last year during this pandemic is that we were approached by many of these youth groups that we work with in the informal settlements, both in Kenya, Somalia, and strangely enough, Ecuador. And they came to us and said, listen, our communities are terrified of what's going on. And what they really perceived was they wanted to do something that they felt they could do. And they came up with the concept of hand washing stations. So starting in March, and by August, mid-August, International Youth Day, we announced it. They had done 2.5 million hand washes between 94 stations over a multiple of communities, informal settlements and such. And they also did a whole other range of COVID prevention things everywhere, from livelihoods and so on. And it was a runner-up for the Secretary General's Award for Innovation. And again, this was driven by them. They came to us. It wasn't us going to them. And I get what it's really ended up for us is more of a proof of concept that young people are capable. The concept of youth-led can happen, and it happens in and around these centers. And the centers have become the core of this emergency response. They've been places where everything is based, and yeah. So that would be about it.
Thanks so much, Doug. We're going to switch over to Harold now, who also since 2006 has been really innovating on this model across Central America. Harold?
Thank you, Michael, and just congratulations on the toolkit launching. I think it's a great asset. And thanks for inviting. I'm a firm believer of the beauty and the virtues of youth centers. We started in 2006, started in Guatemala, just implementing a USAID crime prevention project. Had very little funding. We're looking for solutions to reduce crime in communities, working in different communities, very high-risk communities. And we were coming from an experience of establishing a youth house, a larger youth house with paid staff, coordinators, trainers, and facing the reality that that's not sustainable. And USAID projects are not going to stay there forever. So we were just challenged to think, how can we bring solutions to the communities that are going to remain beyond us? And that's what the outreach centers are. Outreach centers are sustainable, they're scalable. They provide an anchor in the communities for youth. Many of those communities that you saw in the first video, you see rural communities, and you see peaceful communities when you get there, but most of them, had gangs, gang gang groups in those communities, and that's the only role model that youth in those communities had. So the outreach centers offer a different way of seeing the community and trying to really deal with those risk factors that drive youth into violence. So initially we started with 3 outreach centers and basically trying to involve faith-based organizations because we saw they were actually playing a role in preventing crime in those communities. We had $16,000 for each outreach center. And we were assuming that the faith-based organizations were going to pay the salaries of the coordinators later on. Well, that wasn't the reality. You know, they didn't have the funds. And that's why we started involving the community-based organizations and involving the local governments. As Doug said, local governments are key for that sustainability. The outreach centers, they offer a space, a safe space for youth in those communities. And as you saw in the video, you have from gyms, labs, and tutoring, which is great, just for kids to come and do their homework. And that's a safe place for them. One of the key components of that outreach center is the coordinator. They're youth from the same communities. And they are taught into believing in the youth themselves. Many of these youth coming to the outreach, many of those are dropouts. They don't believe in themselves. They lack identity, and that's the role of a coordinator and the role of the volunteers. Volunteers are the backbone of the centers because, you know, they are volunteers. And in the last project in El Salvador, you know, we're like 3,500 volunteers working in outreach centers at a certain time, a certain period of time, which is great. You know, the impact in the lives of the volunteers, you know, as you talk to the volunteers and what the outreach centers have meant to them, you know, and where they are right now, is also an indirect outcome of the centers. We first started in 2006 in Guatemala and expanded to El Salvador in 2008, 2009 in Honduras, and 2010 in Panama. The model has expanded up to almost 300 outreach centers in the region. And it has expanded, one, because USAID believe in the model. You know, it started under a cooperative agreement. It's moved to 5 or 6 different projects that USAID has been replicating. There's some centers that are being funded by the private sector, which is also good, 1 or 2 in El Salvador, 2 by the Embassy of Canada, but mostly USAID is the funder of the centers. Each center is $25,000. As a result, we increased the investment for the outreach centers, at least in El Salvador. And basically, the operation is from $7,000 to $8,000, $9,000, you know, per year. And that's because, you know, the only paid staff is the coordinator. And basically, local governments paid for that salary, paid for the rent. And as you saw, some of the houses are not great, but it doesn't matter. It's what you find in the community. The hardware is not important, as you said. You know, it's the software and the sense of protection of those youth and that you have in those communities. The role that the coordinators play. You know, we have many anecdotes of coordinators, you know, just negotiating with the gang to just rescue a kid, an 11-year-old kid from the gang. One I remember was this coordinator talking to the gang group and telling them, you know, please give me this kid. And one of the responses was, okay, you can take him to the outreach center. He has to go to church and he has to stay in the outreach center. If he goes back into crime or comes back here, you're going to be responsible. So this type of commitment that the volunteers have in each center is what makes a difference. Of course, the reduction of homicides has happened in Central America, and many of those communities, I wouldn't say it's just because of the outreach centers, definitely not, but the outreach centers have played a role in those communities. We have videos with police officers saying how the community changed when the outreach center was established in the community. And it's just because the kids were not on the streets. They had a place to go. They had people who cared for them. So basically, and now in the times of the pandemic, the outreach centers have played a very important role in terms of emergency assistance. Many of those coordinators, have been moving and distributing goods in the communities, medicines, and they are leaders in the community and respected by community members. One of the centers I just found out, just bringing, collecting the homework in the mornings from the teachers through the outreach center's internet. So the kids do the homework, and in the afternoon, they bring the homework back to the outreach center, so the coordinator will send it to the teachers just because they don't have any computers. And so basically, the outreach center is it's an anchor in that community. It's sustainable. It's scalable, and makes a difference in those in people's lives in specific communities, in those specifically those affected by crime and gangs.
Thank you so much, Harold. That's great to get three different models and perspectives. I want to go to a fairly rapid round of questions because of the limited time we have. So I want to start with Sarah Morin's question about curious about impact and how we measure that. And what do you wish you could capture through monitoring and evaluation that's been hard to capture so far? What do you observe that you wish you could prove? Anybody want to jump on that one?
I'd love to,
we
Mike.
Prove that,
I think
that people are less likely to be involved in violence or migrate.
Right. Well, I love that question. I think all three of us on the panel and you, Mike, have been involved. We've done randomized control trials. We've done all kinds of studies. We're currently doing several studies, I should say, with partners who do the studies with us, because most of them are external evaluations. And I think, although we've proven many of the things, I think all of us have worked on life skills, on resiliency, on reducing aggressive behavior, reducing violence. One of the things that I just want to put out there that I think we're missing, and maybe it's because we're so focused on these RCTs and not other forms of research, but I think one of the things we're missing is kind of the intangibles of what this does from a community building standpoint. Because the research methods right now are so focused and the gold standard is this RCT, there's a lot of nuance that I think, so Sarah, that question, what do we wish we could prove? I think longitudinal studies would be amazing. Harold was talking about stories that young people, what's happened in the future. And we've looked at some of our graduates as well and what they've done. But I think we're missing something really important. And that nuance of the social fabric aspect of what these centers generate, whether they're school-based or community-based or in refugee camps, I think we're still missing that. So I love that question because I think we have a huge challenge in front of us in terms of measuring, capturing the nuance.
That's a great answer. And I know Glasswing's done some really remarkable work also on social emotional skills development and psychosocial support and the role that plays of young people having that safe space to build that sense of agency again. Doug or Harold, any quick thoughts on that one?
No, basically, go ahead, Doug.
You sure? Okay.
Yeah.
Just taking off on the previous, I think the thing that fascinates me most, and I've seen it actually in the last 2 or 3 weeks, and I've commented on it, is social capital and the building of social capital, and actually the choice of social capital. I've had in the last, just came up to me in the last while that I've seen the choices where young people have decided not to do something for personal gain, but to do something for social capital, for gain to social capital. Oftentimes it has to do around marriages, deaths, whatever. And it just fascinates me the kind of how people, the choices that are made to be, and how that builds community. Because oftentimes, I mean, from a UN perspective, oftentimes ILO comes across with a purely economic argument. If you get them jobs, all will be well, and that's good. And that is not what we've heard. We did a study in Somalia with the World Bank, specifically looking at what did the Somali young people want, really where they went. And yes, livelihoods came up, but the major thing, they wanted to be heard. Governance was it. They hated corruption. They wanted to figure out ways around it. And so that to me speaks to this kind of, again, this, what you were, Selena, you were saying, I mean, this kind of social mesh, social capital. What's this kind of, can we break ourselves out of this westernized model of finances seem to advance all into what I think is the real value to a lot of these communities and their ability to make the trade-offs that to them really matter, you know. And I've had this discussion with one of my volunteers. I'm like, what are you doing? You're going all the way up country in the middle of a pandemic to go to a funeral. Why are you doing that? This could have impacts on this and this. And it's like, and the answer is almost the stare of, well, why are you even asking that question? Yeah. And I think that's to, you know, I find that that's what holds together these communities, that there is this binding, there's this, and how do you measure that and equate it to all the other things that we're told to equate to, which oftentimes are very economic and such. So anyways.
So question for Harold, you in, you know, the 300 centers, this was a question from the morning, but I want to bring up now, given the long history of the variety of youth centers around the world, are we seeing broader social inclusion within the centers that attract vulnerable groups, whether it's LGBT or a balance between young men and young women in the centers? Are there more advanced centers able to include sensitive topics like gender-based violence prevention? What would be your take on that?
Well, many of those centers were established in a very conservative type of communities. You know, we promoted definitely gender understanding, and we invited. The center is open for everybody. There's an issue of religion too, because you have centers, you know, that are probably supported by Catholic Church or by Evangelical Church, you know, and so how can you really kind of promote that the center is for everyone? And I think we've been successful in that sense, you know. And we don't have any LGBT programs per se in the centers, you know, has been informed, has been talked to, but I'm not sure right now how many LGBT members we have in those centers.
Young men and young women, out of curiosity.
It's almost 50-50. We were counting how many youth in each center, women and men. It's almost 50-50, you know. So it's despite that the males are the ones more affected by violence, more, you know, in terms of joining gangs and in terms of being the victims of crimes, you know. So many of the initiatives, you know, you want to give those males more better opportunities to reduce their involvement in gangs, you know, but it's 50-50, you know, everyone is involved. And talking, you know, in terms of, we still have to measure a lot of the impact of these centers, but how can you measure a reduction of recruitment from a gang? You know, it's just we have a perception, you know, we just measure perception in terms of a reduction in crimes and murders, robberies, safety in the communities, houses that were empty right now, people are returning, these kind of things. But I really want, how many members, how many of those youth in an outreach center would have been in a gang. We don't know that because they're in the center. So those kind of that type of impact, is just hard to measure. But I just want to finish here. It's just when you're implementing projects like these, you have your personnel and you're limited by 8 hours a week and probably more. And there's no way you could be in many of those communities, in many of those municipalities full time. But the centers and the coordinators and the municipalities and the community-based organizations and the faith-based organizations, they are full-time. So in a way, they become an extended arms of a crime prevention project, and they're mitigating crime and providing counseling. There's no value in that, and we can't measure that. It's just.
So a question for all three of you, and drawing from a question from Paul Teeple, about what have been the aha moments when you know that older leaders are trusting youth and including them more in the center's decision-making. Want to talk about this issue of how are your models really engaging young people to be partners in these centers and really bringing an authentic voice and, avoiding the trap of just kind of running a center for youth rather than running a center with youth?
Mike, I think and I'll say just quickly, I think we've been trying more and more to just involve participants in giving us feedback. We've even had instances where we've had them interview staff we're considering hiring, because if they don't have rapport with young people, and it's not going to work. And then recently, I'll tell really quickly, we had this whole list of character strengths that we were going to use based on the evidence, right? The evidence. And then when we asked a group of students what character strengths they would pick, and we had all the right ones that ticked all the boxes, we had left one out that they picked as one of their top character strengths, and that was hope. So I think when we list all these things that we want to do and we want to achieve, just goes back to making sure we keep asking and making sure that we do that regularly, not just once, but that we're doing that regularly. And I think at least in our case, we can always do more, but we really strive to make sure that we're being student-centered and really client-centered in the way we're doing work. Yeah.
Other thoughts?
I think. Well,
go ahead.
You go this time then. You go this time.
No, I was going to bring the issue of in terms of the benefits of the centers. Even the issue of migration. Is why kids leave the country. Is lack of opportunities and lack of basic economic opportunities, but also, believing that they can make a difference and they can make a change in their own countries, and they have to migrate, and in that sense, some of the centers have been, they have great stories too about kids that wanted to leave and they're not leaving. I don't think it's the solution, but in terms of contributions to the larger needs of youth in those communities, and basically, it depends on the strength of the coordinator. We actually believe in coordinators from the same communities. They are young. They don't have to be a psychologist. They don't have to be a social promoter. They probably could have even, just having attended any college studies. But they are brilliant and they are committed. They're leaders and they believe in the other youth, and that's enough for the success of a center.
Yeah. We're coming close up on the. Go ahead, Doug.
Just in terms of leadership, it is challenging. What we try to do as well is to kind of get layered leadership in terms of giving young people a chance to test out their leadership. So whether it's child to child, youth to child, young person to younger, older, like trying to at least have people kind of come up through that way so that we can, we really like to see people coming up through the ranks versus hiring outside or hiring for specific skill sets. And a lot of times, because we're dealing with, we're dealing with young people that don't have the skill sets. I think that we work on that. And the second thing I just wanted to mention was the issue of gender. It was quite fascinating we did when we set up the youth center in Mogadishu, because it was in a Muslim community. And we said, mixed, and then from the leaders of the communities, they said split, men, women, two centers basically. And then we sat down with the youth and they said, no, we don't want that. We think we can make this happen. And it was the young people that we worked with to kind of convince that there could be ways of having blended programming, even though there had to be separate spaces, which I still believe anyways in any structured center, that you have to create safe spaces for women. I mean, yes, women may not be going into gangs, but they face a whole other level of violence that you don't see. And the whole other level of stigmatization that you don't see. You need to create safe spaces for them within centers, because at least in the informal settlements and such, we found a lot in the region here, is that it's often men that come out. It's the men that have the mobility, the men that end up overwhelming your center. So you need to create that space to make it happen. Anyways.
Awesome. So I'm going to give you each 30 seconds for a closing question here. Some people would say, oh, youth centers, their heyday was the 80s in this country or region, or in the 90s in Central America, or in the 2010s, What is the one thing? We've got this great new toolkit, but it's just a toolkit. What is the biggest thing that we as a donor community, as an implementing partner community, in partnership with networks of young leaders in these communities, what's the one thing that really we should be focusing on in the year ahead if we really want to increase the quality and the scale and sustainability of safe spaces, after school programs, and youth centers? Harold.
Yes, one of the you would love to have, outreach centers, what they have with the state-of-the-art equipment, or the best training tools and the best trainers. But, I had to keep that up in our thinking and our design, just to make the centers sustainable. So, just as we say, the outreach centers are not vocational centers. They provide the training and based on the expertise of the volunteers, and some they even, just get Japanese in one center, because one of the volunteers is a Japanese speaker and they're training youth in Japanese. But that I wouldn't trade that, even, if it is the most sophisticated center in terms of training and equipment, I wouldn't trade that for the sustainability. That model that can be replicated, low cost, that the cost should be distributed among different local governments. I think that is something that makes a difference.
Great. Selena.
I would say just remember that this takes time. It takes time to engender ownership and to get these things going. Harold's, mentioning sustainability. And then also really thinking about how we can partner with public sector too, whether it's municipalities or ministries of education in the case of our school-based models. But I think partnerships are really important to be able to scale this and reach more young people and children.
Awesome.
Thanks,
Doug.
Yeah, for us, partnership with local government, listening to the community and what the community needs. I guess the number of, I've seen the number of failed youth centers and the continue try to make them happen, yet they keep coming back. It's not like people just say, oh, well, youth centers failed, so we'll never do them again. There's government policies and policies to renew them and so on and so on. And that's what suggests to me is that there's a missing pieces. And I think this toolkit could be one amazing piece towards actually providing the tools for government or whoever's, or youth or community, whoever's trying to build these centers out, because it's definitely something we've looked at as well, is that the desire is there, demand is there. It's just that they oftentimes they're built wrong. They're just not built in a way that are sustainable.
Thank you three so much for your insights, your commitment to it. Thanks for everybody who was on. We are capturing all the questions, and we will try and find a way to send a response back to you if you've submitted a question. Our ask of you, please download the toolkit or get the hyperlink, share it out through your social media, share it out through your networks. If you go to Youth League Global on Instagram or Twitter or on Facebook, you could also find a link to it all. Blast it out through your networks. We look forward to how all of our agencies work together to make that opportunity that every young person should have access to a quality, safe space program in their community. And thanks again. Take care.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks.
Awesome
Thank
job,
you.
guys. Thank you.
Thanks.
So we'll